only job was to light the lamps, a task that seemed simple enough for a girl who owned nothing, not even herself. But on one sweltering Mississippi night, the flames meant to brighten the Beaumont family's parlor instead became Lydia Carter's escape. When the fire finally died, the family was unharmed. The house scarred, and Lydia was gone. Only her legend lingered, a whisper about a shadow that never left. Before we go further, make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The day began like every other, in darkness. Before the Mississippi sun broke through the suffocating haze, Lydia was already awake. It was 1844 and the air on the Beaumont plantation was thick and alive, heavy with damp earth and the ghost of last night's smoke. From her cot in the cramped slave quarters, she listened as the world stirred not with bird song, but with cicadas buzzing like the ticking of a clock eating away the hours of her stolen life. She moved quietly, bare feet silent on the packed dirt floor. No one had ever recorded her age. No one cared to. What she did have was a sharp mind she kept hidden, her eyes always watching, reading moods, patterns, and danger. Each breath she took, each order she obeyed, was another moment of her life stolen and spent to enrich the Beaumonts. Through the small window of her cabin, Lydia could see the main house, a towering white mansion gleaming faintly in the dawn like a ghost. Its pillars looked like bones, pale and cold, rising from the manicured lawn. It was a place of beauty, built on cruelty. Her day belonged to it, her life measured by its bells and by the whims of those inside. She dressed in her coarse linen gown, feeling the scratch of the fabric against her skin, and braced herself to disappear into obedience once more. That evening, when the day's heat still clung to the air, Lydia performed the duty that defined her, lighting the parlor lamps. The grand room was the pride of the Beaumonts, filled with velvet curtains, the color of dried blood. French furniture polished to perfection, and portraits of stern ancestors who had passed down both their wealth and their sins. To Lydia, the parlor felt like a cage disguised as a palace. The air smelled of beeswax and age, the silence heavy and watchful. She trimmed wicks, cleaned glass, poured oil, and moved with precision, a ritual of control in a life where she had none. As she worked, she felt the painted eyes of the Beaumont's portraits following her, seeing not a woman, but an instrument, a possession. That night the air was unnervingly still, the heat unmoving. As Lydia replaced a chimney by the fireplace, the door opened. James Beaumont entered, the master's son, arrogant, handsome, in the careless way of those who never suffered. Still at it, Lydia, he said, voice smooth but commanding. Make them burn bright. We have guests. She kept her eyes on her work. Yes, sir, she said softly. He moved closer, the smell of whiskey thick on his breath. Father says you're the most reliable girl we've got. I wonder just how reliable you can be. His hand landed on her arm. It wasn't violent, but it didn't have to be. The touch said everything, ownership, power, threat. Lydia froze, rage burning under her skin hotter than the oil flame beside her. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. Instead, she shifted slightly, the lamp between them, like a fragile shield. The oil needs my attention, sir, she said, voice steady. Wouldn't want to spill. He lingered, thumb brushing her skin, savoring her stillness. Then with a low laugh, he stepped back and left her standing alone in the dim, suffocating room. Lydia stayed there for a long moment, her grip tight on the lamp. The fire inside her, silent, furious, unending, burned brighter than ever. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and the Beaumont mansion had slipped into uneasy sleep, Lydia returned to the parlor for her final rounds. The house was silent now, save for the faint creaks of settling wood and the rhythmic hum of insects outside. The lamps she had tended earlier still burned their soft glow, spilling over velvet and gold, giving the room an illusion of peace. It was in this stillness that everything changed. Lydia leaned in to adjust the flame on a tall lamp near the heavy crimson curtains. Somewhere above an open window let in a faint, mischievous breeze. It was barely enough to stir the air, but enough to change everything. The draft caught the lamp's flame, and in one fleeting moment, it leapt sideways like a living thing. The curtain caught instantly. A low hiss, then a breathless whoosh, and the room came alive in orange light. For an instant, the fire was beautiful, a flicker of defiance blooming against the suffocating elegance of the parlor. Then beauty turned to chaos. The flames raced upward, devouring velvet, swallowing portraits, eating through wood and oil with an unholy hunger. Within moments, the air filled with thick, choking smoke. Upstairs, shouts erupted. Doors flew open. The Beaumonts, roused by the smell and the strange flickering glow, cried out in confusion. But Lydia didn't move. She stood motionless before the roaring fire, her face bathed in its light. To her, it wasn't destruction, it was justice. The flames consumed everything that had defined her servitude, the portrait's painted eyes that had watched her without compassion. The polished French furniture that gleamed with stolen wealth, the silken curtains that had muffled the sound of human suffering. In that moment, Lydia saw freedom, not fear. The last thing anyone saw before the parlor collapsed into a storm of smoke and cinders was her silhouette, slim, unmoving calm as the world burned around her. Then she was gone. When dawn came, the grand parlor of the Beaumont plantation was a blackened ruin. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet ash and ruin. The lawn, once pristine, had turned to muck from the frantic buckets of water thrown through the night. The great house stood wounded, one of its proud wings gutted and hollow. Alistair Beaumont stormed across the yard, his fury as hot as the embers still glowing beneath the wreckage. He saw not the miracle of his family's survival, but the devastation of his wealth. Ruined, he roared, gesturing toward the skeletal remains of furniture and scorched walls. Imported from France, all of it. Do you have any idea what this cost me? His voice echoed sharp and cracking with rage. His wife, Eleanor, stood nearby, wrapped in a silk robe, trembling from shock and exhaustion. Alistair, please, she whispered. The children are safe. That's what matters. He turned on her, his eyes wild and glassy. Safe. Look at this. This is a disaster, and it happened on that girl's watch. His words were laced with venom. Find her, he ordered, jabbing a finger toward the charred ruins. If she caused this, she'll pay for every last cent. Eleanor's eyes darted toward the burned-out parlor, her voice faltering. The fire was everywhere. Perhaps she didn't make it out. For a heartbeat, even Alistair hesitated, but only for a heartbeat. Then he scoffed, waving off the idea. If she's dead, it's one less mouth to feed. A slave can be replaced. The settee cannot. As the sun climbed higher, the overseer and a few men were sent into the ruins to search. They stepped carefully across the ashen floor, the heat still rising from beneath their bare feet. The air was thick, every breath tasting of soot and smoke. They dug through the debris, broken glass, melted metal, the warped frame of a piano, but found nothing human. No bones. No body. Not even the smallest trace of the linen dress she had worn. Only the blackened handle of a lamp and the warped remains of the silver scissors she used to trim the wicks. The overseer, a man hardened by years of cruelty and indifference, stood in the wreckage, scratching his head. It made no sense. The fire had been too fierce, too fast for anyone to escape. But Lydia Carter was nowhere to be found. When he reported back to Alistair Beaumont, the master's face twisted with disbelief and fury. Nothing, he barked. The overseer swallowed hard. No sign of her at all, sir. Alistair's eyes narrowed. Then she ran. He spat. She set the fire and fled. She'll be found. But she never was. From that day on, they said that when night fell and the lamps were lit, a shadow sometimes moved across the parlor's ruins, thin, silent, and surrounded by the faint smell of smoke. Lydia Carter had vanished, but her fire had not gone out. There was nowhere for her to go. That was what made it so impossible. The overseer shifted on his feet, his hat twisting nervously in his hands before he spoke again. It's like she just evaporated, sir. The words hung in the morning air, heavy and unnatural. Alistair Beaumont stared at him, the fury in his eyes dimming into something colder, stranger. For the first time in his life, the world had refused to make sense. Property didn't simply vanish, but Lydia Carter had. In the slave quarters, a different kind of silence took hold. Here the loss wasn't measured in furniture or French imports. It was measured in hearts, in whispered prayers, in the weight of something that felt almost sacred. Sarah sat hunched on a rough wooden stool, tears streaking her face. Lydia had been her closest friend, maybe her only one. She wept not just from sorrow, but from fear, because she knew what the Beaumonts would believe. They'll say she ran, she whispered hoarsely to the old man beside her. They'll send the dogs after her. Jacob, ancient and carved by time, shook his head slowly. His eyes clouded, but wise, were fixed on the horizon. No child, he murmured, his voice deep and slow as thunder rolling in the distance. Fire don't hide what it eats. Always leaves something behind, a tooth, a bone, a bit of cloth. But this fire didn't. He paused, and in the flicker of dawn light, his face seemed older still. No blood, no body. That ain't fire, child. That's something else. Around them, the others fell silent. The idea, half hope, half fear, took root among them. Maybe Lydia hadn't died. Maybe she'd been taken somewhere no master could follow. Maybe she'd finally found freedom beyond the reach of this world. A few nights later, under a sliver of cold silver moon, the house lay restless. Mistress Eleanor Beaumont could not sleep. The smell of smoke still haunted the drapes of her grand bedroom, clinging like guilt. She rose, wrapped in her robe, and drifted to the window, overlooking the ruined parlor. The blackened frame of the old window stared back at her like empty eyes. She was about to draw the curtains when something inside the ruin moved. A flicker, faint and quick. Her breath caught. She told herself it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, or the wind playing tricks, but her heart knew better. She leaned forward, squinting into the dark. There it was again. A shape darker than the shadows around it. The moonlight spilled through the ruins, silvering the charred walls, but this shadow swallowed the light instead of reflecting it. It drifted along the wall, slow, smooth, deliberate, like a ribbon of night sliding through the air. For one heartbeat, it took on form, slender, upright, almost human. Then it melted away. Eleanor stumbled back, her hand clamped over her mouth. The shadow had moved with purpose, with grace, and with a rhythm she recognized. It moved the way Lydia Carter had moved when she thought no one was watching. Downstairs, Alistair's confusion hardened into venomous rage. The world had betrayed him. His possessions had burned, and one had vanished entirely. It was an insult to the laws. He lived by a wound to his pride. He summoned Finch, his overseer, a small, mean man with a permanent sneer and a taste for cruelty. "Someone knows something," Alistair snarled. "Find them. I don't care how." Finch obeyed with enthusiasm. He descended upon the slave quarters like a storm, tearing through cabins, kicking over meager belongings, and barking questions that no one dared to answer. fear spread faster than the fire had. His voice was low, deliberate venom wrapped in calm. Who helped her? Who's lying? He demanded. His whip coiled loosely in his hand, promising pain. But the one he watched most closely was Sarah. He saw her swollen eyes and shaking hands, mistaking grief for guilt. One afternoon, as she drew water from the well, Finch cornered her. His shadow fell over her long and cold. "Where is she?" he asked softly, almost kindly. But his tone carried the weight of a blade. Sarah's heart pounded. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she didn't know that no one could know. But the words caught in her throat. Because part of her, deep down, wasn't sure Lydia was gone at all. She'd heard the whispers at night, the sound of footsteps near the old parlor, the faint scent of smoke drifting through the dark. And sometimes when the moonlight hit the fields just right, she could swear she saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. Did she have a lover? Finch's voice dripped with suspicion as he loomed over Sarah. Some buck from another plantation who promised her a new life. Sarah kept her gaze fixed on the muddy ground, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know, Mr. Finch. I swear I don't." Finch leaned closer, his breath sour and hot against her cheek. "Don't lie to me, girl. She planned this, didn't she? The fire was her distraction, and you helped her. Tell me where she went, and maybe the master will show mercy." His tone suggested anything but mercy. Over the following days, his questioning turned to punishment. He withheld food, then water, forcing Sarah to work under the crushing Mississippi sun until her arms shook and her knees buckled. Still, she said nothing, not out of defiance, but because she truly didn't know. The truth was worse than rebellion. It was mystery. And that to Finch was intolerable. His cruelty achieved nothing but spreading fear like a disease through the quarters. The more he demanded answers, the more silent the people became. For the first time, the Beaumont's power had met a limit it could not bend or break. While Finch unleashed his fury below, the Beaumont household, above, began to crumble in quieter ways. James Beaumont, once the picture of Southern arrogance, became a haunted shell. He drifted through the halls with hollow eyes snapping at servants and draining bottles of whiskey from morning to night. He avoided the parlor wing entirely, as if the air there burned his skin. Even a glance toward the blackened windows sent him retreating like a frightened child. The mere mention of Lydia's name provoked him into fits of violent denial. His father watched with thinly veiled disgust, but suspicion flickered beneath the anger. One humid evening, Alistair confronted him in the dining room. "You were in the parlor that night," he said flatly. "A servant saw you. Did you see anything?" James's hand trembled, spilling whiskey over the edge of his glass. "I saw fire," he snapped, too loud, too quick. "What else was there to see?" Alistair stepped closer, voice low and cutting. "The girl was careful, James. The most careful we had. A missing slave is a theft from my pocket, and a ruined room costs me dearly. So I'll ask again, what happened in that room?" James's jaw tightened. Behind his bloodshot eyes, memory replayed like a curse, his hand gripping Lydia's arm, her eyes flashing with fury. His voice slurred with entitlement. The shame of it burned hotter than the fire ever had. But he wasn't haunted by guilt for her. He was haunted by fear of his father's wrath. "Nothing happened," he shouted, voice cracking. "She was insolent, that's all. I left. The fire started after. It wasn't my fault." He slammed his glass down, the shattering sound echoing through the hollow house. Alistair said nothing, but the silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. As the Beaumonts turned on one another, something else began to stir in the ruins. The shadow that had first flickered at the edges of Mistress Eleanor's vision now appeared more often and to more people. At first it was whispers, a servant catching movement from the corner of an eye, a candle guttering when no breeze blew. But soon the sightings became impossible to ignore. The moment that sealed the legend came on a blistering afternoon when Mistress Eleanor, desperate to reclaim control of her home, ordered the parlor's doorways boarded up. She sent Clara, a young maid, to do it. Clara hesitated on the threshold, hammer and nails trembling in her hands. The moment she stepped closer, the air changed. The thick, humid heat of the day gave way to a chilling dampness that raised goosebumps on her arms. She paused, breath shallow, listening. Then she heard a faint rustle like silk dragging over stone. Her eyes darted to the far wall. At first, she saw nothing but soot and ruin. Then the soot began to move. Slowly, deliberately, the black dust gathered, swirling as though pulled by invisible hands. Clara's breath hitched. Before her eyes, it took shape, a woman's silhouette, tall and unmistakably human. It clung to the wall like a living shadow, yet its presence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. For one endless moment, it was still. Then its head turned. There were no features, no eyes, no face, only darkness, but Clara felt it looking at her. The weight of that gaze pressed down like ice in her chest. The hammer slipped from her hand, clattering against the floor, and the shadow dissolved. The soot scattered, settling back into formless dust. Clara screamed, a raw, piercing sound that tore through the house and shattered whatever peace remained. She fled, her cries echoing through the halls. By nightfall, every servant knew the story. By morning, even the field hands whispered it. The Beaumonts had built their home on fire and ownership, but now the fire had birthed something they could never own. Lydia Carter was gone, but her shadow remained, walking the halls she once served in silence, reminding them all that some chains once broken never fade. Sarah remembered the way Lydia used to stand quiet, watchful, never wasting words but seeing everything. There had always been something different about her, a kind of still strength that made people uneasy, even those who owned her. And then one night, as Sarah sat huddled in her cabin, the memory came back sharp and sudden, something Lydia had shown her months before the fire. Lydia had pulled her behind the smokehouse, her eyes bright with a secret she could barely contain. From the hollow of an old oak, she drew out a small pouch made from a scrap of stolen velvet. Inside was a strange little collection, threads of every color, a blue jay's feather, and a twisted piece of root that looked like a clawed hand. To Sarah, it had seemed like nothing, the kind of nonsense a lonely girl might keep to feel special. But Lydia had spoken softly, reverently, as if handling sacred things. She told Sarah about her great-grandmother, a woman stolen from Africa, who had carried with her stories older than chains, older than pain. She said the body could be bound, but the spirit, the true self, could not. That a spirit could learn to slip the cage of flesh if it was strong enough to remember how. At the time, Sarah had been frightened. Talk like that was dangerous. Such ideas didn't belong to this world, not here, not now. She had laughed it off, told Lydia to keep her strange stories quiet. But now, sitting alone in the dark, the memory of that pouch and those words struck her like a lightning bolt. Lydia's voice echoed in her mind, low and certain. My great-grandmother taught my grandmother, who taught my mother. When the chains get too heavy, there are other ways to be free, ways they can't see. Sarah hadn't understood then. Now she did. Maybe Lydia hadn't escaped the way the Beaumonts imagined. Maybe she had freed herself in a way they couldn't begin to comprehend. The thought filled her with both dread and wonder. She looked toward the ruined mansion, its windows black and hollow, like open graves, and for the first time, she didn't feel pity for Lydia. She felt awe. Inside the house, the air had grown cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from weather, but the deep, unnatural chill of a place that's been emptied of peace. It crept along the floorboards, seeped into the walls, and wrapped itself around the Beaumonts like a living thing. Mistress Eleanor felt it most. The servants were trembling wrecks, the halls thick with whispers that stopped when she entered. And James, her son, looked like a man rotting from the inside out. She found him in the library one evening, the scent of liquor heavy in the air. He sat slumped in a chair, a book open but unread, staring at nothing. "The servants are terrified," she said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was calm but sharp, like glass about to crack. "They say it's Lydia. They say her shadow walks the parlor walls." She stepped closer. "What did you do to that girl, James?" His whole body jerked. Color drained from his face, leaving it pale and slick with sweat. "Nothing," he stammered. "It was an accident." Eleanor's eyes hardened. "An accident that destroyed half my home and left a girl missing. You expect me to believe that James's mouth worked soundlessly before he broke, the words spilling out in a trembling rush. She was defiant, he choked. She looked at me like I was nothing. I told her to mind her place. But she didn't. I grabbed her arm and she slapped me." His voice cracked. "No one's ever done that before." I pushed her back. The lamp, it fell. The curtain. He broke down completely, sobbing. "I didn't mean it, Mother. I thought she ran after me. I thought she got out." Eleanor stood motionless, every word slicing through her like a knife. The horror of the truth settled on her. Not just the fire, not just the lies, but the revelation of who her son truly was. The arrogance, the cruelty, the cowardice. It was all laid bare. She felt a wave of sickness rise in her throat. Her son had not only taken a girl's life, but had unleashed something far worse. The raised voices from the library carried out through the open windows, echoing across the yard where Sarah was folding linens. She heard the sobs, the anger, the shattering of something deep and final between mother and son. Though she couldn't make out the words, she knew instinctively what they meant. The Beaumonts' world was breaking apart. The air around the house seemed to hum with a strange, invisible energy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Sarah dropped her basket and ran not toward her cabin, but to old Jacob's. He would understand what Lydia had done. Because whatever haunted that house now, it wasn't vengeance. It was liberation. Sarah had gone to old Jacob because she needed understanding, not comfort. She needed someone whose memory stretched beyond the Beaumonts' rule, someone who remembered a time before the house, before the chains. She found him sitting on his stool outside his cabin, the low sun painting long shadows across the dust. His knife moved slowly, shaving curls of wood that fell like pale feathers around his feet. When she approached, he looked up, and his eyes, dark, deep, and knowing, told her he already understood why she had come. Her words came out in a rush. She told him everything, the fear that gripped the quarters, the arguments she'd overheard, the haunted silence of the house. Then, almost whispering, she told him about Lydia's pouch, the colored threads, the feather, the twisted root, and the words that had branded themselves in her mind. There are more ways to be free than just running. Jacob listened without interrupting the rhythm of his knife, never breaking. When she finished, the silence between them stretched long and heavy, filled with the hum of insects and the faint crackle of the cicadas. Then he set the knife aside and met her gaze. "Your friend," he said softly, "was wise, wiser than most. She remembered things they tried to beat out of us." He leaned forward, his voice low, almost like a prayer. Lydia's great-grandmother came from a land where people walked with their shadows not behind them. They say she carried that knowing across the ocean, the way to slip free of flesh when the chains got too heavy, the way to walk inside your own shadow. Sarah shivered. You mean she died? Jacob shook his head slowly. No child. That's what the Beaumonts would call it. But death is what they made us believe in, not what we were born knowing. Ghosts are what happens when someone's taken too soon, when their spirit gets stuck. This, what your friend did, that's different. She didn't die. She became. He gestured toward the mansion, now nothing more than a silhouette against the orange sky. That house isn't haunted, child. It's claimed. She's not trapped in those walls. She owns them now. That night the legend became flesh. James Beaumont woke from a restless, fevered sleep drenched in sweat. The echo of his mother's voice still tangled with his dreams. The moonlight poured through his window in hard silver beams, slicing the darkness into perfect squares. For a moment, he thought he'd heard something, a faint rustle like silk brushing across the floorboards. He sat up, telling himself it was nothing, the whiskey playing tricks on his mind. But then he noticed the wall. The shadow of the window frame fell across it as usual. But the cross-shaped pattern was wrong. One side was thicker, darker, moving. As he stared frozen, that extra piece of darkness separated from the rest, gliding away from the wall with impossible grace. It was shapeless at first, then slender, upright, unmistakably human. There was no sound, no footstep, just a presence cold and deliberate. It wasn't a shadow cast by something, it was something, a void in the shape of a woman. His breath stopped. The world around him seemed to collapse into that single shape. He knew her instantly, the curve of her shoulders, the tilt of her head, Lydia. The thing glided forward slow as dripping ink sliding across the moonlit wall until it reached the edge of the light. Then it slipped into the darkness beside his bed. The air grew colder than death. James tried to scream, but only a rasp escaped, dry and pitiful. He could feel her there, the weight of her judgment pressing down on his chest, the suffocating certainty that he was not alone, not forgiven, and not safe. Then he screamed. It was a sound ripped from the pit of his soul. A sound that shattered the stillness of the house, echoing down every corridor, through every locked door. The plantation itself seemed to hold its breath. From that night forward, the Beaumont Empire began to rot in earnest. The overseer's whip lost its sting. The field hands moved like sleepwalkers, eyes darting toward the mansion, hands trembling with every gust of wind. Cotton went unpicked, tools lay forgotten in the dirt. Even the air felt cursed thick with dread, as if Lydia's rage had seeped into the soil itself. Alistair Beaumont responded with fury, ordering more punishments, more lashes, but it made no difference. Fear of the whip was nothing compared to fear of the shadow. Whispers spread among workers, travelers, even neighboring planters, of strange noises in the night, of a pale smoke that hung above the Beaumont land long after the fire of screams that rose and died with the moon. When Alistair tried to sell a parcel of land to recoup his losses, the deal collapsed. No one wanted cursed ground. The Beaumont name, once a symbol of wealth and power, became a whispered warning. And inside the mansion, what remained of the family dissolved. Eleanor withdrew to a distant room, refusing to speak to her husband or her son. Her silence became her vengeance. Alistair drank himself into oblivion, staring into ledgers that no longer meant anything. His empire of cruelty and cotton had been undone not by rebellion, not by war, but by a woman he thought he owned. And James became a ghost long before his death. The encounter in his bedroom had broken him. He flinched at every sound, every shifting shadow. He saw her everywhere, in mirrors and corners, in the flicker of lamplight. The house that had once been his inheritance became his cage, and his guilt his punishment. Through it all, the shadow in the parlor grew stronger, more deliberate. It no longer drifted aimlessly or flickered in secret. It began to speak, not in words but in motion, in patterns traced across soot and stone. One evening, Sarah stood hidden among the overgrown roses near the ruined parlor, watching with her heart hammering. The air inside was perfectly still, the last sunlight fading from the walls. Then she saw it. The soot on the far wall began to move not with wind, but with purpose. The black dust swirled and drew together, forming a line. Slowly, it began to trace shapes deliberate and sure as if an unseen hand were writing. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the faint outline of words took form, letters scrawled in shadow and ash. She stepped closer, unable to stop herself, the meaning dawning like fire in her chest. Lydia hadn't vanished. She was still there, and she was writing her freedom into the walls of the house that once enslaved her. Sarah held her breath as the shadow traced a mark on the scorched wall, a curling symbol split by a clean line, one she had seen Lydia practice in the dirt months before, while whispering about a secret language passed from mother to daughter, a history hidden from the Beaumonts. This was not random fear, but a message, and day after day from her hiding place, she watched new signs emerge until the wall read like a living chronicle, a pained defiance, and a spirit that refused to be erased. While Sarah read, Alistair Beaumont hit his limit drunk on rage, and Brandy swearing he would purge the house by force. He gripped the whip that had long defined his rule, and marched into the ruined parlor, cursing the darkness, and striking the walls, as if ownership could be shouted back into existence. The answer came like a tide. Shadow poured from the black room and flowed across the lawn to the whipping post, wrapped it tight, and rose in the clear shape of Lydia Carter, not frail or fading, but tall and still claimed and unbreakable, a figure of night with her face turned toward the master who had believed he owned her. In that silent beat, Alistair saw himself stripped bare. Then the form dissolved, and the shadow slipped away, leaving the post, the house, and a man undone. The whip fell from his hand, and the family broke. That night they packed in shame and silence, Eleanor veiled and rigid, Alistair shaking and small, James empty-eyed and mute, and they fled without farewell, abandoning their kingdom to the thing they could not command. In the weeks that followed, the land curdled into legend. For white neighbors, Beaumont Place became a cautionary tale told over whiskey and fans about a cursed house, a weak heir, and the vengeful ghost of a slave who brought ruin to her betters, a story designed to keep the old order intact. For the black community, quiet cabins and hidden praise houses held another truth. Not a ghost story, but a testament that Lydia had stepped beyond chains into a freedom the masters could not see, and that the shadow writing on the parlor wall was not a threat, but a record and a victory. It became a gospel. Among the freed people, no one spoke of Lydia Carter as a ghost. That word was too small, too sad for what she had become. They spoke of Lydia's freedom. They spoke of her not as a victim, but as a conqueror, a woman who had used fire not to destroy herself, but to burn away every trace of her bondage. The shadow that haunted Beaumont Plantation was not a curse, they said. It was a monument. She had transformed herself into something greater, a spirit who reclaimed the land and watched over those who worked it in freedom. For the black community, the ruin became holy ground. Men and women would walk its borders in the dark, whispering her name like a prayer, seeking her strength. Her story was retold not as warning, but as promise, a scripture of defiance, proof that freedom could take forms their former masters could never understand. Decades passed. The war came, and with it the shattering of the old world. The Beaumont's empire was gone. The fields once stained with sweat and blood were now worked by the hands of free men and women. 25 years later, Sarah, older, softer, Her face carved by time into lines of grace and endurance sat on the porch of her small cabin as the sun melted into gold and violet. Around her feet her grandchildren clustered, their eyes wide, their laughter softening into quiet anticipation. "Tell us again, Grandma," one little girl whispered. "Tell us about the Shadow Lady." Sarah smiled. "They thought they owned her." She began, her voice low and steady. "They owned her mother and her mother before that. They put their name on her, their chains on her. And they thought that was the end of her story. But they only owned her body, and that was the least part of her. Her spirit, that fire they couldn't touch." The children leaned closer, their eyes shining in the firelight. Sarah's voice grew strong. She traded that body for a freedom no man could take. She burned her chains away, and when the fire was done, she was still here, stronger than ever. She reached into a small cloth bag beside her chair and took out a smooth stone. With a piece of charcoal from the fire, she drew the symbol, a swirl cut by a single straight line. The children watched in silence. "She had her own language," Sarah said softly. "A way of remembering, of saying, 'We were here.' This is how she wrote her story on the wall they built to contain her. And now, we write it again." She drew another mark and another, teaching them the alphabet of freedom. The language that had survived in whispers and symbols, the true story of Lydia Carter, the woman who refused to vanish. Years later, the story's final chapter belonged to the land itself. The Beaumont parlor, once a blackened wound, had softened. Ivy crept over the broken walls, wildflowers bloomed in the cracks, and in the center, a young tree reached through the ruined roof toward the stars. The moonlight fell in gentle silver, and the air grew still. On the one remaining wall, the one where the shadow had first written, the darkness deepened. Something stirred. Slowly, a shape detached itself from the black, smooth and tall, its surface absorbing the moonlight. It glided across the wall with the same graceful stillness that once defined Lydia Carter. The shadow turned its head toward the open window, looking out over the free fields and the cabins glowing with lamplight. It was not a ghost, nor a remnant of suffering. It was a sentinel, a spirit born of fire and will. Lydia Carter had not vanished. She had remade herself, not into something bound by death, but into something eternal. Her disappearance was not an ending. It was her ascension, her final act of rebellion, her refusal to be owned by any man, any world, or even the grave. And as long as shadows touched the earth she once worked, Lydia Carter would remain silent, steadfast, and free.